Workers came to the Slate Valley of New York and Vermont by the hundreds from 1850 through the 1930s. First from Wales, then Ireland, Italy, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Austria, Yugoslavia, and Canada, compelled for economic and political reasons to leave their homelands and seek their livelihoods in the back-breaking slate industry. They descended on a mainly Protestant Yankee agricultural landscape, working side by side with local farmers who had discovered outcroppings of slate in their fields as early as 1820. Antagonism and bigotry, even among the immigrants themselves, developed not only in the quarries, but on the streets of the dozen slate villages that dot a 30-mile stretch of the New York and Vermont border. Transience was inherent in the boom and bust slate industry, with workers moving from one quarry to another whenever work was available. Job instability, combined with discrepancies in wages, led to sporadic strikes, almost always over pay and work hours. Quarryman Adam Maslach remembered what his father told him.
Those people were tough, though. They were tough. Father was saying one day that there was people walking around up on the quarry and, walking around. He says, the boss told my father, he says, hey, those people are looking for your job, so you better work. Yeah. But that's all they knew, from birth to death, to work to survive.
The work was risky. Accidents and death were considered to be part of the job. Despite the challenges, quarrymen continued to work, lifting the slate out of the quarry, splitting it, and refining it into hundreds of useful products, from school slates to slate roofs. Slate maker John Red Zajac described the working conditions.
It is dangerous, Bob. Jeepers, one bit of carelessness, you could lose a foot, an arm, your life. And in those days, they had no safety regulations or laws. And like old Joe Bernard, he lost an arm. Another Kubush, he lost a leg, and no compensation. He got a few bucks that tied him over, but it was all rough, tough, and nasty.
This is the story of the slate workers and heavy lifting, continuing through generations, from human and horsepower to steam and diesel engine power. The sounds are real. The continuous noises of the quarry and yard, the steady voices of quarrymen, and the clanging of metal against rock. The story is about strong men and women doing hard work and the evolution of the industrial technology that has lightened their load. Heavy lifting, a human and technological history of moving slate from quarry to market, begins in 1850 and continues into the present. Since the beginning of commercial production of slate in the region, heavy lifting has been one of the greatest challenges to the industry's workers. Whether hoisting raw slate blocks that could weigh as much as 12,000 pounds up from the quarry pit to the mill yard, moving the stone through the production process, hauling the finished slates to market, or removing the 90% of unusable waste rock from the quarry. The weight of the stone has defined the strength of the workers and the capacity of the industry's technology. Slate worker Ron Dool offered this summary.
The quarry industry itself is very hard-working people with hard work, very low pay, and you get a day's work out of them.
Slate was quarried on a small scale for mill stock and foundation stone as early as the 1820s in western Rutland County, Vermont. By 1850, 5 companies in the county were manufacturing roofing slate. The completion of the Rutland and Washington Railroad line through Castleton, Poultney, and Granville in 1852 vastly expanded the market for slate beyond the local area to other parts of the Northeast and the Midwest. This new mode of transportation forced advances in heavy lifting technology to meet the demand for roofing slate, which has been the backbone of the industry. The railroad remained the primary mode of transportation of slate to the marketplace through the 1960s. Slate workers, along with horses, oxen, and mules, were the first sources of power for heavy lifting. These draft animals were common and numerous in slate operations, powering simple lifting technology like boom derricks, pulling slate blocks from the side of the pit through the yard, and hauling the finished product by carts and wagons to the rail yards to await shipping. Teamsters, the men who drove the draft animals, were an important part of every quarry operation. Bernie Capron, a quarryman, had his introduction to the slate quarries through the farm.
But I was not in the quarry. I was on the farm end of it, because the company had 10 horses, and that'd be 5 teams of horses that hauled the slate off the hill. What was the hill where the quarries were located was called Briar Hill. And the slate was brought down to a terminal and loaded into the freight cars.
In the northern part of the Slate Valley, horses and other animals were used to draw barges or sleds loaded with finished slate across Lake Bomazeen to the rail yard in Hydeville. The remains of one of the barges still rests at the bottom of the lake, not far from the west side of historic Cedar Mountain. At first, horse and mule-driven wagons were used to haul slate blocks directly out of the quarries. As many of the quarries in the area grew larger, the swinging arm of a boom derrick at the edge of the pit, with pulley system attached, was employed to reach further and deeper. A man yanking a tag line swung the boom, bringing the newly extracted block around to a point outside the pit. These simple machines were also used throughout the yard to move the heavy blocks. Boom derricks could be very dangerous and took many quarrymen's lives. A Welsh observer wrote this description, which appeared in an 1881 issue of the Welsh American newspaper Edric.
While I was in Vermont, one man was killed by being snatched into Mr. Evan D. Jones's quarry by the derrick's rope, the which in all likelihood entangled around his members so that he could not free himself in time to save himself. It is vanity to say that it is not possible to work the derricks without the men being in danger of being thrown on their heads to the bottom of the quarries. I believe that the derricks of Europe are used far more skillfully than the derricks of America. They appear untidy machines, and seeing huge rocks swaying in the air at the end of a rope above the heads of workers is terrifying enough to send chills through the whole bodies of men unused to such sights.
Though effective at hoisting sizable blocks up from the quarry, boom derricks could only hoist blocks that were located under the limited radius of the boom. Horses were occasionally used to provide the power to early boom derricks by turning a windlass, until steam became more prevalent as a source of power in the quarry, first powering winches and hoisters.
This is ground sulfur on his foot.
Steam-powered hoisters greatly increased the capacity for heavy lifting and became ubiquitous in slate quarry operations in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Like other machinery in use in the quarry, hoisters were adapted to electricity when it came to the Slate Valley in 1900. As quarries became deeper and wider, quarry sticks and aerial carriers called carriages began to be used. Quarry workers could now send up blocks from a larger area using the carriages that were moved along a cable system that stretched from one side of the pit to the other. There were many styles of carriages, the homemade products of thrift and ingenuity, and others manufactured from patented drawings like the Jones and Hooker models that carry the names of the two quarrymen who invented them. Rigger Sam Jones, Sr., recalled the carriages.
The old Hooker carriage made up here in Pulteney Foundry, and the Ruggles. They had made Ruggle machinery, gas engines went in up here in Pulteney. But this Hooker was a large carriage, and had a drum inside of it with a brake on it. And when the lever slacked off, the levers would drop, and a brake band on it would drop down. And that would lock it. You had a small brake rope in the center, which would hold it right there where minutes you slacked off. And then they had the Ruggles. That's a little different. That had a cast iron shoe in it, in the center. And that was a little better carriage. But Owen Jones come out with one. He called it the Owen Jones carriage. And that had a lock in the center, very much lighter, handier, and it only had 2 wheels, whereas other carriages had 3 wheels. And this was a very good little carriage.
Men at the bottom of the pit worked in tandem with the cable operator, wrapping 6,000-pound slabs of slate with chain and attaching them to a billy wheel that was lowered from the carriage and then raised and carried out of the pit. Rubbish from the pit was removed in the same manner and dumped at the side of the yard. Quarrymen filled the rubbish buckets by hand before they were raised by the billy wheel. Even though efforts were made to make the system safe, the quarry stick and cable system could spell danger for the men at the bottom of the pit. The movement of large blocks of slate overhead, spills from the rubbish bucket, and breaking cables were a constant peril to the workers in the pit. Charlie Roberts recalled a narrow escape.
One narrow escape I had there when I was on the pit. We were told, and it was common sense, that when the bucket goes up, see, there were 3 cables, 3 half-inch steel cables that pulled it up. They always told us to get out from under it. One day I didn't, and a lot of time with those 3 cables, sometimes that bucket would twist, because you'd have to raise it 100, 125 feet maybe up to the cable. Well, one day there was a big chunk of rock fell out of it. And I just kept pushing back against the thing. The darn thing landed right in front of me there. Another couple of feet, and I wouldn't be talking to you today. And it's all in learning. That's all you got to learn, where to stand and what to do.
The first job of a young boy in the quarry was one of great responsibility. He was assigned the job of making hand motions at the top of the pit to signal the movement of the carriage to the quarrymen and the cable operator simultaneously. When electricity reached the quarries, bell signals in a particular code were transmitted between the pit and the engine house. Narrow gauge rails and rail trucks, which were first used with boom derricks for rubbish removal, were adapted for use in the yard and mill. Workers used them to move heavy blocks, rubbish, and finished products. Forced by gravity or horses, narrow gauge rails, even the train on the most efficient path from the quarry to the mill or waste dump. Hundreds of quarry sticks stood in the Slate Valley during the height of the industry in 1900, and the massive conical piles of rubbish that still dot the valley represent the tons of material moved out of the pit by human hands. Most quarries abandoned this technology in the 1950s, but the method continued to be used in a few quarries into the 1970s. Although the technology for hauling slate blocks out of the pit improved, teamsters still transported the finished product to rail yards. One exception was an aerial tramway at the old Inconger Slate Company quarry on the west side of Lake St. Catherine. Built in 1891, it ran 1 3/4 miles from the quarry to a rail siding in Raceville, New York. Quarryman Jim Covino remembered the details of this innovative heavy lifting technology.
The tramway was situated about, I would say, 2 miles west of the Lake St. Catherine on a quarry dump. And from there it traveled west to the railroad siding in Raceville, New York. It was operated by steam to begin with, and then they got an oil engine, and then in 1912 they put a 150 horsepower motor to operate it, electricity. It took 2 men to load the tramway, which is worth having, and 1 man to operate the machine. And then at the railroad siding they had 2 men taking the slate out, and another one putting lath on the slate so that they could drop the slate so that the slate wouldn't pinch with each other. So they used lath, wood lath, dropping them in the railroad car. And you had to do that while the tramway was in motion.
Trucks began making an appearance in the industry in the early 1900s, easing the job of transporting finished slate to the rail yards and replacing horse-drawn carts, as well as the tramway. The first trucks had hard rubber tires and flatbeds. Workers at the mill stacked slate onto the truck bed by hand. When the trucks reached the rail yard, other workers unloaded the truck by hand into side sheds where it stayed until it was hand-stacked once again into a railroad car. The Washington-Rutland rail line, nicknamed the Slate Picker, ran through the heart of the Slate Valley and was the lifeline for the industry. It stopped at a handful of individual quarries and at centrally located side yards to pick up roofing slate. Workers in the rail yards carefully packed the slate into boxcars. The laborious task of loading a boxcar took time to learn properly, as stacker Jim Pomeroy described.
Carried 20 squares to a load, and they made 5 trips, 100 square for the day. The 2 men on the truck were experts, packers, and they showed me lots of tricks, and after a while I got better. Then I got a job with O.W. Owens driving the truck and packing slate in boxcars. They had a Mack truck with hard rubber tires and no windshield, just a curtain with isinglass that rolled up and down.
Loading the boxcar was not the last time the finished roofing slates would be stacked individually. There were still workers at the other end who unloaded it, and eventually others who carried it to the rooftops. The region's slate companies produced the largest quantity of roofing slate in Slate Valley history around the turn of the 20th century, shipping out over 250,000 squares of slate for 4 consecutive years, starting in 1889, and hitting a record 402,000 squares of slate in 1908. A square of slate is the amount of roofing slate required to cover 100 square feet. A square can range in weight from 700 to 8,000 pounds, depending on its thickness. Therefore, at the peak of production in 1908, when thinner slates were preferred, over 281 million pounds of finished slate was moved from quarry to market by the combined strength of the industry's workers and relatively simple machines powered by steam and electricity. That staggering figure does not include handling the 90% of waste that fill the rubbish buckets. After its peak in 1908, the industry began a slow decline, first during World War I and then during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The industry had all but collapsed by the end of World War II. As it reemerged in the 1950s, the industry began to go through very significant technological changes, ushering in new methods of moving slate from quarry to market. Surplus World War II machinery found its way to the Slate Valley. During this time, heavy earth-moving equipment began replacing shoveling by hand, and also made it possible to build roads into the quarries. Quarry owner and operator John Maslach talked about the thrift of quarry operators as they built their fleet of modern machinery, ideally made up of several gas and diesel-powered machines: a crane, a shovel, a backhoe, a dump truck, and a forklift.
First they get shovels, scoop shovels, front shovels, steam shovels, as well as commonly called them, even though they were not operated by steam, and that allowed them to move the rubbish. They would be used in conjunction with the quarry sticks. Oftentimes they didn't have roads in the pits, so they would actually cable his machines right down the slant of the quarry into the quarry itself. After that, of course, as the whole method of moving goods around the country turned to the truck, the pallet became quite important, so the forklift comes into play. Evergreen Slate Company over here, for a lot of the small operators for years and years, and right into the 70s, actually had a forklift that they towed behind their truck because some of the small operators couldn't afford to have a forklift on site. They were always expensive pieces of equipment, but everyone got one as quickly as they could. You wholesaled the site to Evergreen, and of course they wanted it, and it was easier and more efficient for them to bring the forklift and load the pallets onto the truck than it was to load the slate by hand.
During this period, it was common to see a mix of old and new technology in the quarries. Quarry sticks and carriages flanked early models of excavators. Perhaps the most significant gain in using earth-moving machines in the slate quarries was their ability to quickly move rubbish out of the pit. For a time, cable-operated shovels worked in concert with rubbish buckets and quarry sticks to eliminate the laborious task of hand-shoveling waste rock, which, as pitman Ray Cull remembered, could take several weeks of work, especially when a blast went wrong.
And one time we was up to the eastern quarry there, and it's a quarry's about, I'll say 110 feet deep. Well, they already got way to the bottom, and we worked with an incline. So they went up on top, and wagon drilled it, and tried to bowl it off. Well, they did bowl on. And we spent 10 weeks shoveling by hand till we could get down to something where we could work it out.
With rubbish-removing shovels, quarry operators built roads into the quarries, allowing dump trucks and excavators easy access to the rock face and the freshly extracted blocks. Blocks could be hauled up to the yard and milled more efficiently with fewer workers. As heavy machines became prevalent in slate quarries, hydraulic lifters, excavators, and backhoes replaced their cable-powered predecessors. Another pivotal change in heavy lifting in the 1950s was the adaptation of the wooden pallet for transporting finished slates. Slates no longer needed to be hand-loaded several times in order to get them to market. Slates were finished in the mill and stacked onto a pallet that was delivered to the job site. Trucks were loaded and unloaded with forklifts. This remarkable innovation reduced the time and labor of stacking finished slate repeatedly in the process of shipping. The development of the tractor-trailer truck, which can carry a 47,000-pound load, greatly reduced the use of the railroad. Slate could now be shipped on these massive 18-wheel, 65-foot rigs using the extensive interstate system along the East Coast and across the Midwest. Railroads remain the transportation system of choice, only for West Coast markets. For today's international market, pallets have been modified to become enclosed crates that are packed into containers. The containers are trucked to rail yards or ocean harbors to be shipped throughout the world. Longtime slate broker Clark Hicks described the advances in modern methods of moving slate from mill to market.
A little more modern times, you had to make changes that would get your slate to market faster and get it to the customers. So we tried to give them a method to get it to their job sites or wherever it was going, so that it would be more easily for them to handle. And would obviously help, sell your product. In the 50s and early 60s, when we were still shipping a lot of boxcars of slate. On the other end, on the receiving end, the labor to do it. And then as we got into the late 60s and 70s, everybody was having labor problems to do that kind of work. And of course, so you had to use material handling equipment to make these things more efficient.
Size and power are evident in the gigantic machines that are used in modern quarry operations. In the pit, excavators with 6-foot wide buckets are coupled with hauler trucks capable of carrying 80,000 pounds of slate or waste rock, 2 to 3 times as much as a standard tandem truck. Quarry owner and operator Dick Roop talked about the efficiency of his new Caterpillar machines.
The excavator you took pictures of that weighs right around 128,000 pounds has a 6-foot wide bucket. It's what they call a mass excavator because it moves a lot of material fast. The machine is what you need for a quarry, at least that size, for hauling rubbish. The haulage truck is about 12 feet wide, holds 40 ton or 80,000 pounds. The box is 11.5 feet wide, whereas standard tandem or single axle truck, the box is, as a rule, are 7 feet wide. They're computerized, you have different power levels, you just push a button. Some of them are automatically controlled throttles. You can set your power level, you can set your dig mode, like you want your boom to rise faster than your stick, you can swing or even fine tune it. There are plenty of different options.
Evidence of the evolution of heavy lifting technology in the region's slate industry is vanishing quickly. Much of it disappeared in the scrap metal drives during World War II. Early model derricks, shovels, and excavators, which still stand sentinel over the quarries as newer machinery replaces them, are being recycled even now for the rising value of scrap metal. Quarry sticks, unused for decades, are succumbing to the elements and falling down after years of marking the quarries. One of the last remaining sticks in the Slate Valley stands over the Eureka Quarry near Poultney. New workers are replacing the older quarrymen who remembered how their work was transformed by the evolution of industrial technology. The story continues today in the 100 active quarries that pit the narrow strip of land along the New York-Vermont border. With the help of modern machines, strong men and women continue to do good work, many of them descendants of the Yankee farmers and the hundreds of strangers from other lands who were the first heavy lifters. Third-generation Slovak slate maker Michael Labas paid this tribute.
But there are some families that have done a really good job with it, to be commended.